is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue Assassination with research specialist Mae Brussell. For KLRB, I'm Gloria Barron. Well, Mae, this is Wednesday, and this Friday, you're appearing here tonight. This Friday, you'll be on Dick Bragg's program on KIDD, I understand, and that'll be from 7 to 8. So I wanted our listeners to know that it's sort of a continuing thing, I guess, between Dick and I.
Week, yes. Yeah.
And I know that he has given us credit quite a number of times.
You tell the listeners to turn on KLRB.
I did want them to know that you would be on KIDD on Friday night between 7 and 8, and that's sort of a question and answer period, isn't it?
Yes, Dick has a program called Hot Seat, and he has guests every night from 7 to 8, and this is the third week that I've been invited on, and I hope we can be able to keep this up, because any questions that people have or information they want me to look up, they can talk about on his show. You can write to KLRB or call them, or you can call direct. And I like the direct calls because, first of all, there's no preparation involved, and secondly, you can show how vast your research is because you can handle and throw out sources of information to look up. It's working very well.
Right. Now, today we're going to be talking about the Buckley article in last night's paper, the new Sputnik article, and let's see, Tom Wicker's article.
Well, we're going to take...
And also the Young Americans for Freedom.
That's right. We're going to take the format that we usually use, take the weekly or daily news, and this is what we try to do in this show. We're trying to show everybody who has listened in the past and continues to listen, and the new listeners, that what we're doing is taking the news each week as it comes along and analyzing it and showing how the news pertains to the political assassinations of the past and why the political assassinations are not a dead issue, that they're very much alive. And I would like people to take the program seriously, and I will give you sources of information to look up or books to read. And I want you to believe that something happened in our government in the 60s that started us on the road downhill in every single way that can be mentioned. And that I think I can take each one of these problems and say the cause of it was done by the political assassinations, by the power being usurped violently, and the people not knowing what's happening to themselves. And until they realize what has happened, they cannot halt all the violence or the street revolution or the future assassinations. And I think very seriously we are in a lot of trouble, and I wish people would continue to listen and tell their friends to listen and try to come with an open piece of mind, a clean piece of gray matter, and leave a little room for a new idea as I throw it out. And that's what we're going to talk about, political assassinations every week. Last night's paper in the Monterey Herald, many of you people can get that right now, still in your homes, around the kitchen, or by the side of the furniture, and you can look up an article which you probably missed. I think a lot of people do not know how to read the paper yet, or what they're reading. The information that I get, a lot of my research is in the paper, and people do not appreciate that they could have that same information, and I want to interpret it for you, if I may. William Buckley has an article called Interview with Chew and Lie. And as a researcher in the Kennedy assassination, this is one of the most important articles, politically, historically, that I have had in 7 years. It begins to say, in quotes, in Latin America, particularly in Chile and Mexico, the rage is an interview that has just been published by a Mexican journalist between Julia Garcia and Chew and Lie. The editor-manager of the Excelsior, published in Mexico City, had spent 2.5 hours with Chew. It is a rich and long interview, full of interesting bits and pieces. Chew tells us, for instance, that the truth of the assassination of President Kennedy has not yet been revealed. End quotes. Now that coming out in the news media is terribly important because I've been bringing in to the radio and reading sections for the last 3 weeks from an magazine called Sputnik that's published in the Soviet Union, and I brought with me a copy, August 1971, today. Now the Western nations, our allies, Germany, France, Italy, Great Britain, none of the nations ever accepted the truth that John Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. They were told not to discuss it. They were threatened. They were threatened that foreign aid would be cut off. We put every pressure on them not to discuss the assassinations in this country. The Soviet Union knew that Oswald was an agent of the CIA while he was there for 2 years. They said it publicly at the time of the assassination, but they've been very, very quiet for 7 years. China has intelligence agents all over the world, certainly working with the Russians, certainly knowing what happened. But for the first time in 7 years, China is talking about the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, what is making the Soviet nation, Soviet Union talk about this? Why is China talking about it? We are coming to a very important point historically in 1972 in the United States of America. The government was overthrown, in my opinion, in 1963. But the pretending of having an election in 72 and going through the motions, we will nominate men like Richard Nixon, who was nominated before and won, and we will put in people who were knowledgeable or could expose the assassinations. If they weren't on the planning, John Connally and Richard Nixon, they could expose the truth. Spiro Agnew came in on the death of Martin Luther King. He worked closely with Robert Lally of the FBI. He was put in by the Papas Foundation, who told Richard Nixon to take him as vice president. If he wanted to run and have money for running the campaign, he would take Agnew. The Papas Foundation overthrew a democracy in Greece. We have spent lives, American lives, dollars, millions, billions of dollars going down the drain. We have done everything wrong in the last year since 1960 when President Kennedy was elected. He was not a saint. He was not perfect. But when the government was overthrown, we put so much money into arms and wasted our money, wasted our talent and our energy. Now we're coming to the point in 1972 that the Soviet Union and Chu and I know that we would be in very serious trouble if this team got into election again. Now, Gloria, we remember the very first program we talked about the Pentagon Papers, and I said the American government had one more thing to swallow besides the really hidden reasons why we went into Vietnam, the truth of the Kennedy murders and Martin Luther King and other political assassinations. Remember, I said this is the one thing we have to grow up and take.
Yes, you did say that on the first.
It was in June when we made our first tape, and this is the 13th of a series, and I was emphatic, and I said this is what we have to take. Now, if these nations, our so-called enemies as against our allies, are exposing how our government was usurped, they can blackmail us into any position. They can say, Richard Nixon, we want you to come to China. They can say, we want you not to bomb this area. They can put any terms they want on us, and we are a blackmailed nation, and we are living like blackmailed people. If we would only tell what everyone else in the world knows, they couldn't hold it over on us. But the public officials in power are not going to do that. It's up to the people. This is why we're on the air, to reach the people and make them realize that we are being blackmailed into foreign policies which make us embarrassed, make us a 10th-rate nation. Now, Mr. Buckley went on to say something else which was interesting. He talked about the decline of the British Empire, and he quoted Chu as saying this. He quotes Richard Nixon, rather, in Kansas City, who said, in quotes, the decline of the British Empire has proved the inadequacy of parliamentary democracy. Then he went on to say, even Nixon recognized on July the 6th, 1971, in a press conference that 25 years ago, it would have been impossible even to imagine that U.S. prestige would have fallen as low as it is now. As he contemplates the 20 years since the end of World War II, the United States has suffered such loss of prestige throughout the world that even the President indicates his surprise. The origin of these problems, the lack of prestige, we know well. It is due to the attempt of the United States to dominate the world. Now, the United States after World War II set in an intelligence operation that ran our country, and they were ill-advised. They took a decision which was disastrous. We handed over the reins to Allen Dulles, the State Department, John Foster Dulles, and the CIA, the Dulles brothers, and Henry Luce, and these kind of people made the decision to arm against what they thought were the communists, and they depleted all the resources and the morality of the things that America had stood and died for. Now, these are broad sweeping statements, but I feel that William Buckley is the first writer to come out in 6 years and even repeat the story of what Chu and Lai is saying about America. We have other writers every day, Jack Anderson, Max Lerner, James Reston, Walter Lippmann, Mr. Kirkpatrick, Joseph Alsop, Harrison Salisbury. Every night they write and write and write. Every day they have articles in the paper. And not one of them has mentioned the Kennedy assassination. And if they do, they put down the conspiracy as a negative, or they ignore it as a cause for all the problems that they write articles every night about problems in the world today, and they never attribute them to the assassination of John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King. And I feel that it's time that they get to the subject. And Mr. Buckley's bringing it up last night, I think is important, because the Buckleys are arch conservatives. I don't agree with their opinions. They're pretty self-centered. They make some broad sweeping statements I don't like. But I've never associated the Buckleys in all my research with any of the assassination teams. And I think the Buckleys would benefit politically. If we were to remove the top people in office that are there now, you'd probably, the only conservative left would be the two Buckleys. You know, I mean, of the top conservatives. And I think Mr. Buckley can be very sure of himself when he talks about the death of John Kennedy in his article, because he's not involved, at least not in my research. And he can, if you take the others and remove them from power, he stands it. Now, I brought the Sputnik, but I'm not going to read it today. The first issue, we've gone over the first issue really carefully. Another issue on what's happening in Dallas goes into Jim Garrison, and it's fascinating, and I should do a whole show on it. But Tom Wicker last night had an article on Nixon's musical chairs, and he's talking about putting Spiro Agnew in as a justice on the Supreme Court. You know, I have said before on these programs that Spiro Agnew should not be vice president of the United States. He passed because he didn't have to be scrutinized. The electoral process is such that if the man running for president says, I want this particular man, he gets in on a package deal. And that is terrible. Remember we talked about May's law, that we should have a law to change the process. And I wrote this to almost every member of Congress in 1970, that a thing like this shouldn't be allowed, because when you elect a justice of the Supreme Court, he has to be approved through committees. Where he's been, what his decisions are, is he fair? And I think that even to entertain the idea that Spiro Agnew be on the Supreme Court, considering his relationship with, again, the CIA and the FBI and the way he came to power, should be very carefully scrutinized in Washington. Now, a group in Texas, the Young American for Freedom, had a convention in Houston, and they decided that they would like to see Agnew be the president rather than Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon has betrayed them in making overtures to China, and they gave several reasons why they were in favor of Spiro Agnew. Well, Mrs. Mitchell is back in the act again. She had an article in the paper yesterday backing the Young American for Freedom. Now, John Mitchell was campaign manager of Richard Nixon's campaign in 1968. But his wife, Martha, is backing the Young American for Freedom's group who opposed Richard Nixon's re-election. And she is behind a package deal. Young American for Freedom is raising money, and they have a kit to send to men in the hospitals in Vietnam, the GIs. It would be toothpaste, aftershave, lotion, and dominoes. But in the kit, along with that, would be literature from human events, a weekly newsletter published at Battle Line, the American Conservative Union, New Guard, all this literature, William Buckley's National Review, criticizing Richard Nixon.